What happens when the world stops believing in its own promises? Good evening, and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight, we journey to a Sunday evening half a century ago, a night when the hum of televisions became the drumbeat of history. In today's events story, we revisit the day the dollar lost its soul, the August night when America quietly ended the gold standard, and the world's faith in money itself began to tremble. They called it a temporary suspension. But as with many human decisions, the temporary became destiny. It was August 15th, 1971. Across the United States, families had just finished dinner. Fathers leaned back in armchairs, children played with toy cars, mothers folded laundry. The air was still humid and ordinary until the screen flickered and the familiar face of President Richard Nixon appeared. His tone was calm, reassuring, paternal. "I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold." A sentence so brief, so sterile, yet it detonated across centuries of human habit. For thousands of years, civilization had anchored its trust on metal. Gold, that incorruptible witness of value. From Babylon to London, from Cairo to Wall Street, gold was the moral spine of trade, a covenant between nations and their word. And now, in a single broadcast, that covenant was broken. In the homes of ordinary Americans, it didn't seem like much at first. A man in Detroit turned to his wife and said, "What does that mean?" She shrugged. "Probably nothing. Just politics." The television went back to its evening program, and the sound of laughter filled the room. But in Tokyo, dawn was breaking, and teletypes screamed. Banks froze transactions. Traders stared at their terminals, unsure what any number meant. In London, the pound faltered. In Paris, a few men whispered that de Gaulle had warned this would come, that America could not promise gold forever. And somewhere in a small town in Missouri, a pastor sat at his desk, staring at a Bible open to the words, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." He underlined the verse once more, wondering if the world had just crossed a line invisible but eternal. For nations, gold had been more than a metal. It was restraint, discipline, faith, and something beyond human decree. To unchain the dollar from gold was to declare, "Our word is enough." But is human word ever enough when temptation stands at the printing press? The economists at Camp David had said it was necessary. Inflation, Vietnam, deficits, all demanded relief. But even among them, one advisor whispered, "We are moving from God's measure to man's." No one replied. That night, while the world digested Nixon's announcement, a quiet, unseen storm began to form. Not of weather, but of consequence. Because when value loses its anchor, everything it holds begins to drift. And the people who would wake up on Monday morning, workers, bankers, mothers, pastors, had no idea that the ground beneath their daily lives had just shifted forever. The decision that changed the world wasn't made in Congress, nor in the chaos of Wall Street. It was made in seclusion, behind the guarded gates of Camp David, the presidential retreat nestled in the Maryland woods. It was the second week of August 1971. The heat lay thick over Washington, but inside the retreat's conference lodge, a smaller kind of storm brewed, a storm of numbers, pride, and fear. President Richard Nixon had summoned his most trusted men, John Connally, the sharp-tongued Secretary of the Treasury, Arthur Burns, the anxious Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, the brilliant but uneasy Undersecretary, and a few others, the keepers of the dollar's fate. No staff, no press, no notes. Phones disconnected, documents locked away. Even the Secret Service guards were kept at distance. What would be decided that weekend was too volatile for daylight. The dollar was bleeding. The Vietnam War had drained its veins, and the promises of prosperity had become expensive lies. America had printed more dollars than it could redeem in gold, and foreign governments were lining up at Fort Knox, demanding their bullion back. In simple terms, the U.S. had written checks the gold couldn't cash. Arthur Burns pressed his glasses against his temples. "We're losing control," he whispered. "If France demands another shipment, confidence will collapse." Connally leaned back, cigar smoke curling through the air. "Confidence," he said, "isn't in gold. It's in us. Volker frowned. Until the world stops believing that. By Saturday evening, the debate had turned moral. Burns, the old economist with trembling hands, argued that detaching the dollar from gold was a sin against soundness. He had read the scriptures often, and he believed stability was a form of virtue. Connolly, on the other hand, saw it as liberation. Gold's a relic, he said, a chain around our necks. We need flexibility, not faith in rocks. But Burns shook his head. Flexibility without discipline is temptation, John. It's the serpent's whisper. No one spoke for a long time. The fire in the hearth crackled, ironic, like the world's last gold coin melting. Outside, night settled over the pines. Nixon sat apart from the others, staring at his reflection in a window pane. He was a man torn between loyalty to old order and the terror of economic collapse. To him, this was not only policy, it was survival. He feared inflation, yes, but more than that, he feared political defeat. The 1972 election loomed ahead, and America was restless. Aides later recalled him, muttering, "If the economy sinks, I go down with it." He tapped his desk once and said quietly, "Then we do it. Suspend convertibility, temporarily." There it was. One word that would echo forever. Temporarily. No one at that table believed it would ever be temporary. But no one contradicted the president. That night, before he left the room, Nixon told Burns, "Arthur, this will give us control." Burns looked down and replied, "Control, yes. But at what cost to the soul of money?" The next morning, the men gathered again for breakfast. Eggs, coffee, and quiet relief. Connolly cracked a joke, Nixon forced a smile, and Volker wrote a single line in his notebook. History will judge this not by necessity, but by honesty. By Sunday afternoon, Nixon was back in the White House, preparing his televised address. The speechwriters polished words like temporary, stability, and fairness, while the secretaries distributed embargoed statements to the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. And as the sun dipped behind the Potomac, an entire financial order, the Bretton Woods system that had held the world together since 1944, was quietly dismantled by a few men who didn't yet grasp what they had unleashed. When night fell and the cameras began to roll, Nixon took a deep breath. The world saw only calm, conviction, and confidence. But behind his eyes flickered something else, a shadow of doubt, like a priest before an unholy ritual. He spoke the words anyway. "I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold." And thus, in a single breath, the covenant between value and virtue was undone. The golden anchor was lifted. The dollar was set adrift. But even as Nixon's speech ended, the consequences had already begun to ripple through the unseen corners of the earth, in banks, in hearts, in futures not yet born. Detroit, Michigan. August 16th, 1971, the morning after the announcement. The sun crept through a smoky sky, glinting off the hood of a Ford Galaxy parked outside a small house on 8 Mile Road. Inside, Frank Miller, a 42-year-old assembly worker, tied his boots in silence. His wife, Eleanor, stood at the stove, flipping pancakes that neither of them really wanted. The television replayed Nixon's speech, the black and white image soft with static. "I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury." Frank exhaled. "So, that's it then? No more gold?" Eleanor frowned. "I thought the dollar was always worth something." Frank looked down at his paycheck on the table, $118.32 for the week, and muttered, "Guess we'll find out." At the Ford plant, the air was heavy with talk. Men in oil-stained coveralls leaned over coffee cups, arguing in half-understood economics. "They say the dollar's off gold. Means prices will rise?" "Nah, Nixon wouldn't do that to us. He's the one fighting inflation." "Yeah, well, my cousin in Cleveland says groceries jumped already." The foreman blew his whistle, and the machines roared to life. But the words lingered. For the first time, Frank noticed the noise of money. How every man there earned, spent, and feared the same paper. By noon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had been stolen. Not cash, but certainty. That evening, He stopped at a grocery store on his way home. The clerk was changing the tags on the shelves. "Prices again?" Frank asked. The young man shrugged. "Suppliers raised them this morning. Flour, milk, eggs, all up." Frank laughed bitterly. "After one speech? They work faster than angels." He paid anyway. His dollar bills felt lighter in his hand, like promises fading in the heat. At home, Eleanor was marking the family budget in a notebook. She had grown up during the tail end of the Depression, and every cent was sacred to her. Now, the numbers refused to balance. "Frank," she said quietly, "if everything keeps going up, we'll need another job." He rubbed his eyes. "I already worked 6 days. Maybe I'll start selling the old tools." Silence filled the kitchen. The clock ticked. "Do you think," Eleanor asked hesitantly, "that this is it? The beginning of something?" Frank looked at her, his jaw tight. "I think it's the end of something. Just don't know what." That night, he sat alone on the porch, a cigarette glowing in the dark. Across the street, a neighbor tuned his radio to a financial station. Commentators spoke of temporary measures, monetary realignment, and market optimism. Big words for men in suits. But here, in the heartbeat of industrial America, optimism didn't pay the bills. Frank whispered a small prayer, not for money, but for understanding. For years, he'd believed that hard work and honesty could hold a man steady. Now, it seemed the ground itself could shift beneath him, and no amount of sweat could stop it. He looked at the stars, the same sky his father once trusted under the gold-backed dollar, and wondered if heaven noticed what men had just done to the meaning of faith. He didn't know that, within months, prices would soar, savings would shrink, and the illusion of control would unravel. But for now, in that quiet Detroit night, all he felt was a tremor, faint but unmistakable, like the sound of a world beginning to unmoor. It was Monday morning, August 16th, 1971, in Tokyo, though in truth it felt more like an earthquake that struck without warning. At Mitsui Bank's foreign exchange floor, hundreds of clerks in white shirts and narrow ties crowded around ticker screens. Paper flew like snow in a storm. The dollar, the yen, the mark, their prices flashed faster than anyone could read. At the center stood Kenji Takahashi, a 38-year-old currency analyst. He had been up all night after hearing Nixon's televised address rebroadcast by NHK. At first, he thought he had misunderstood the translation. But now, as markets convulsed before his eyes, he realized he hadn't. The dollar was no longer tied to gold. Kenji's phone rang nonstop. New York, Hong Kong, London. Voices all asking the same question in different languages. What is the dollar worth now? He wanted to answer, but there was no answer. Since the end of the Second World War, Japan had rebuilt its entire post-war miracle on the back of America's currency. Factories, trade, reserves, all denominated in dollars, all anchored in the faith that the United States could always redeem those dollars for gold. That faith had evaporated overnight. He looked at his supervisor, a gray-haired man named Mr. Kobayashi, who had lived through the ruins of 1945. "Sir," Kenji said softly, "should we close trading?" Kobayashi exhaled. "Close it? To what end? The world has already changed. We just haven't accepted it yet." Across the city, newspapers rolled off presses before dawn. Headlines in black ink screamed, "Nixon ends dollar-gold link. World markets in turmoil." By breakfast, commuters read the news on trains, the words trembling slightly in their hands. Housewives listened to radio bulletins about a floating exchange rate. They couldn't comprehend, but instinctively feared. Japan had survived bombs and defeat. But this was different. This was the invisible unraveling of something they had trusted more than politics or armies, stability itself. Kenji stepped out of the building at noon. The usually bustling Ginza district felt strangely muted, as if the city was listening for the next announcement. He bought a bottle of green tea from a vending machine and sat on a bench, watching the crowd. Nearby, two elderly men argued about gold. One said, "It's only paper now. They can print as they wish." The other replied, "Then why not buy everything while we still can?" Kenji closed his eyes. He thought of his father, who had once traded ration coupons during the war. Worthless one day, priceless the next. And suddenly it struck him. The memory of scarcity was back. That evening, as the Tokyo Stock Exchange suspended trading to restore order, Kenji returned home to find his wife Aiko kneeling beside their daughter's futon. She was praying. For what? He asked gently. For peace, she said. They say the world is changing again. He sat beside her and whispered, the world never stops changing. We just pretend it does. But deep down, he felt something else. A chill that came not from fear, but from realization. He had built his life upon the belief that numbers, not gods, ruled the modern age. Yet now, he sensed a lesson far older than markets. Faith misplaced is faith betrayed. That night, Japan's finance minister convened an emergency meeting. He declared that the yen would no longer trade freely. It would be temporarily fixed. The same word that Nixon had used. Temporary. How easily men renamed permanence. As Kenji watched the press conference on television, his daughter stirred in her sleep. He turned down the volume and for a long time stared at her small hand resting against the blanket. Fragile, unknowing, innocent. He wondered what kind of world she would grow up in now. One where value could vanish with a sentence. He didn't know that the floating currency system born that week would redefine global trade, debt, and destiny for generations. But that night in a quiet Tokyo apartment, a father realized that the age of certainty had ended, and a new, faithless world had begun. In a quiet town called Hannibal, Missouri, not far from the Mississippi River, Sunday had always meant one thing: faith. And for Reverend Samuel Harper, faith wasn't an abstract word. It was the measure of every sunrise, every dollar in the collection plate, and every act of trust between man and God. But on August 15th, 1971, as President Nixon's words echoed through the nation, even faith felt uncertain. Samuel had watched the broadcast alone in his church office. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, and a small fan turned slowly beside an open Bible. When Nixon said, "I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold," Samuel froze. He didn't understand global economics, but he understood promises. And to him, this sounded like a promise broken. That night he sat in the empty sanctuary, the silence thick as incense. The moonlight fell across the pulpit, across the offering box carved by his grandfather decades earlier. It still bore the faint smell of cedar and thyme. He reached into the box, took out a single crumpled dollar bill, and turned it in his hand. The ink had faded, the paper was thin, yet the words, "In God we trust," were clear. He whispered aloud, almost to the bill itself, "Do we still?" Monday morning, the phone rang. It was Mark Reynolds, a local farmer and longtime congregant. "Pastor," he said, "I don't mean to bother you, but does this thing with Nixon mean our money ain't worth what it used to be?" Samuel hesitated. "What makes you ask?" "Well," Mark said, "I sold some corn last week. They paid me in cash. But today, feed prices jumped. Feels like the dollar's shrinking overnight." Samuel thought for a moment. "I don't know, Mark," he admitted. "Maybe the dollar didn't change, maybe we did." That week, the town murmured with uncertainty. At the diner, the waitress charged 5 cents more for coffee. At the hardware store, a sign read, "Due to new market adjustments, prices subject to change." Even the children collecting for a school fundraiser asked, "Why do things cost more this week?" Samuel listened quietly, observing the shift not just in numbers, but in hearts. People spoke less of saving, more of surviving, less of gratitude, more of grasping. And he began to wonder, was this merely economics or something spiritual, a test disguised as policy? On Friday, he visited an elderly widow named Mrs. Langley, who lived in a small white house on the edge of town. Her husband had been a banker in the 40s, a man who believed that gold was God's metal. Now, she handed Samuel her grocery receipt, shaking her head. "Bread was 30 cents last week, Reverend." 30. And now it's 40. What happened to our America? Samuel placed a hand over hers. Maybe America's being reminded where its treasure really lies. She smiled faintly. That's kind, Reverend. But kindness doesn't buy bread. He chuckled softly, not out of humor, but helplessness. She was right. That Sunday, his sermon was unlike any he'd given before. He stepped up to the pulpit and held up that same dollar bill from the offering box. The congregation leaned forward. "This week," he said, "our leaders made a decision that may change the course of history. They say our money's no longer tied to gold, but I tell you, gold was never the real anchor. The anchor was trust." He paused, letting the words breathe. When trust fades, in God, in one another, no metal can save us, because when value loses its soul, greed fills the void. The church was silent. A few nodded, others wept quietly. He placed the dollar back into the box and whispered, "It says, 'In God we trust.' Let's make sure that still means something." That afternoon after the service, Samuel walked outside and looked toward the horizon. Endless fields of corn glowing beneath a golden sun. He thought about the irony. The earth still yielded. The sky still held light. God's currency still flowed, unchanged. Maybe humanity had changed its standard of value, but heaven hadn't. He didn't know that in the years to come, faith and finance would drift further apart, until churches themselves would preach prosperity more than humility. But that night, in a Missouri chapel, one man kept watch by candlelight, guarding a truth older than any currency. That integrity is the only wealth that never loses its value. Washington, D.C., September 1971. In the weeks following Nixon's announcement, the nation's capital vibrated with confidence, or at least the performance of it. Newspapers printed phrases like, "Decisive action stabilizes dollar." The Dow Jones rallied, businessmen toasted to new flexibility. Even the television anchors smiled, repeating that familiar word, temporary. But behind the marble walls of the Federal Reserve, a quiet unease lingered. Not the panic of markets, but the whisper of conscience. Arthur Burns, the Federal Reserve chairman, sat in his office late one evening, the city lights flickering through the blinds. In front of him lay a sheet of figures, inflation projections, trade imbalances, employment data, but none of it comforted him. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. In the silence, the ticking of his office clock sounded like judgment. A knock at the door. Paul Volcker, his tall young deputy, entered carrying a folder. "They're calling it the new economic policy," Volcker said. "Price controls, wage freezes, floating currencies. The markets think we've mastered the storm." Burns smiled sadly. "The markets always think that. Until the next one." Volcker hesitated, then said softly, "Do you believe we did the right thing, sir?" Burns leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I believe we did what was possible. Whether it was right, history will decide." That same week in New York City, a fiery young economist named Milton Friedman spoke on television. He smiled confidently as he told America that letting the dollar float was a sign of maturity, that markets, not governments, would now determine value. Gold, he said, is an anachronism, a barbarous relic. What matters is productivity, not metal. People cheered, investors nodded. The future, it seemed, would belong to the clever, not the cautious. But in the audience sat an old professor, Henry Walden, who had taught economics for 40 years and carried the weariness of a man who'd seen nations rise and fall by the same arrogance. After the broadcast, a student asked him, "Do you agree with Dr. Friedman?" Walden smiled faintly. "He's right about efficiency, but wrong about humanity." "What do you mean?" the student pressed. "Economics," Walden said, "used to be about balance, about moral limits. Now it's about how far you can stretch belief before it snaps." Across the ocean in Rome, a Vatican financial advisor wrote a report warning that unmoored currency leads to unmoored conscience. Few read it, fewer cared. The New World was intoxicated by paper promises. Easier credit, higher spending, temporary relief. It was as if nations had discovered how to mint miracles without prayer. But a few voices, scattered economists, pastors, and philosophers, began to sound like prophets in a storm. They warned that once money lost its restraint, greed would grow faster than growth itself. That without an external standard, gold, virtue, or God, humanity would measure value only by appetite. Their warnings were dismissed as nostalgia. The future had no time for prophets. One night, Arthur Burns opened his Bible to the book of Proverbs, a habit he'd kept from childhood. His eyes fell upon a verse. Dishonest scales are an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. He closed the book slowly and whispered, "We've replaced the scales with sentiment." He didn't know Volcker would one day become the man to fight the inflation born of this very weekend. He didn't know that entire generations would measure their worth not in virtue, but in velocity. How fast they could consume, how endlessly they could owe. But he sensed it, and somewhere deep inside, a man of numbers heard the faint echo of conscience. An old, persistent reminder that no economy can outsmart the soul. Because when the moral law of restraint is repealed, inflation is not just a rise in prices, it is a rise in pride. In Peoria, Illinois, autumn came early that year. The cornfields glowed gold under the setting sun, and the air carried the scent of harvest, though not everyone reaped peace from it. Mary Collins, 31 years old, mother of two, sat at her kitchen table surrounded by grocery receipts. She was no economist, but she could read numbers well enough to sense when something had gone wrong. Milk, up 5 cents. Bread, up 7. Sugar, nearly doubled since spring. She bit the end of her pencil and whispered to herself, "How does everything change so fast?" Her husband, Jack, worked as a postal clerk. He had always said the same thing his father once told him. "The dollar is as good as gold." Now, Mary wasn't so sure. The radio hummed in the background, carrying a voice from Washington. A cheerful announcer declared that the president's bold action had stabilized the economy and protected American jobs. Mary frowned. "Then why," she murmured, "does it feel like I'm paying more for less?" Her daughter Annie entered holding a school flyer. "Mom, they're raising the lunch price. Again." Mary forced a smile. "That's all right, sweetheart. We'll figure it out." But inside, she wondered how a single announcement, words spoken hundreds of miles away, could ripple into her kitchen like this. Later that evening, Jack came home, dust from the postal bag still on his sleeves. He dropped his hat on the counter and opened the fridge. "Why's the milk half empty already?" Mary hesitated. "It was cheaper last week. I bought less." He paused, then said, "They'll fix it soon. The papers say it's just temporary." She nodded slowly. That's what they said about the war, too. They both went silent. The war in Vietnam had touched their family more through headlines than blood, but its cost now sat quietly between them, printed on every receipt. That night, after the children were asleep, Mary sat alone with a candle burning on the counter. She took out her notebook and began to list expenses: rent, gas, food, clothes, medicine. The columns refused to balance. At the bottom of the page, she wrote 3 words in shaky pencil: "God help us." She didn't mean it as despair, more as a confession, because she sensed something larger than economics at play, a test of endurance, of faith, of gratitude. The dollar might have lost its gold, but she feared the greater loss was honesty, that silent understanding that value must be earned, not declared. The next morning, she went to the local store early. She noticed a new sign near the counter: "Prices may vary without notice. Thank you for your understanding." She smiled bitterly at the word understanding, as if the world expected her to understand the invisible hands that made her pay more for bread. Behind the counter stood Mr. Walters, the store owner, who'd run that shop since before Mary was born. She asked him, "Do you think things will go back to normal?" He shrugged. "They say the dollar floats now, but I don't see it floating. I see it sinking." As she walked home, Mary passed a church billboard that read, "Our daily bread comes from heaven, not the market." She stopped and smiled faintly. It felt like the first honest sentence she'd seen all week. That evening, she placed the grocery money inside a jar labeled Faith Fund. It wasn't much, a few coins, a couple of folded bills, but it was her way of saying she still trusted in something beyond the reach of markets. Mary Collins would never appear in any history book. Yet, she embodied the story of millions, those who lived the consequences while others debated the causes. And though she could not see it then, her quiet prayers and perseverance were part of the invisible thread holding her family and her country together. While America slept soundly in the afterglow of confidence, Europe did not. Across the Atlantic, the morning of August 16, 1971, dawned with disbelief, irritation, and something older than both: vindication. For years, European leaders had warned that the United States was living beyond its means, paying for wars and welfare with promises instead of balance. Now those promises had been revoked. In Paris, the reaction came sharpest. President Georges Pompidou, successor to Charles de Gaulle, read Nixon's statement twice before setting it down. His face remained calm, but those around him could see the ghost of his predecessor's defiance. De Gaulle, years earlier, had sent French warships to New York to collect gold in exchange for paper dollars, a symbolic protest that humiliated Washington. Now the late general seemed to have spoken from the grave. Pompidou whispered, "He was right." They broke the contract. In the grand hall of the Banque de France, senior economists gathered under a chandelier older than the Republic itself. The conversation was tense. "They said it's temporary," one official murmured. Another replied dryly, "So was every suspension in history." The bank's governor, Olivier Wormser, adjusted his spectacles and said, "Gentlemen, gold is no longer about wealth. It is about truth, and the truth is now negotiable." Meanwhile, in London, the city's newspapers exploded with headlines. Nixon Shock's world, dollar no longer backed by gold. In smoke-filled pubs, brokers and bankers argued between pints. The British pound had already been devalued 2 years earlier. Now the empire's bankers watched the U.S. join them in the same humiliation. At the Bank of England, one official muttered under his breath, "They've turned money into fiction." Yet the markets didn't collapse. Not immediately. Instead, something stranger happened. They adapted. By week's end, the major currencies, the yen, mark, franc, and pound, were floating, no longer bound to a fixed standard. The invisible anchor that had held the post-war world steady, the Bretton Woods system, had been cut. Each nation now drifted on its own tide of speculation, confidence, and fear. In Zurich, Swiss bankers rushed to buy gold before the U.S. closed its export window. By afternoon, the price had risen by nearly 10%, a quiet rebellion against paper. In Rome, the Vatican's financial envoy sent a report to the Secretariat of State. The dollar's separation from gold marks not only an economic shift, but a spiritual one. It reflects man's growing faith in his own decree. In Bonn, West Germany's finance minister declared, "The United States has exported its inflation to the world. Let us pray our people do not pay for their excess." Prayers and protests alike all carried the same undertone: betrayal. That week, a French journalist wrote in Le Monde, "The American dollar was once the world's promise. Now it is its gamble." In cafes and offices, the word trust became the new gold. Invisible, fragile, and easily melted by fear. But there were also optimists. Younger economists called this the dawn of flexibility, arguing that nations could now control their destinies without the chains of gold. To them, the world had evolved. To their elders, it had fallen. One evening, in a quiet church in Lyon, a priest preparing his sermon read the financial pages for the first time in his life. He looked up from the paper and whispered to a colleague, "It seems we've unchained money. But will we ever chain greed again?" The question lingered like incense. Because across Europe, in boardrooms and pews alike, people understood something that markets did not. That when value is no longer bound by honesty, even prosperity begins to decay from within. The old world had measured wealth in stability. The new one would measure it in speed. And Europe, proud, wounded, and wise, watched America's experiment unfold with a mix of resentment and reluctant awe. Late autumn 1971, the decision had been made. The markets had stabilized, and the public approval ratings were soaring. Yet inside the White House, Richard Nixon sat alone, sleepless. He'd saved the dollar, the headline said. He'd restored confidence, the polls showed. He'd done what no president before him had dared to do. But power has a way of demanding payment, not in gold, but in peace of mind. Nixon's secretary had gone home for the night. The only sound was the faint whir of the air conditioner and the occasional pop of static from the television that no one was watching. On the desk before him lay a pile of letters from across America. Farmers thanking him, businessmen praising him, economists debating him. And one letter from a small-town pastor in Missouri, written in neat looping script. Mr. President, I pray that what you have done was necessary and just. But if value can now be printed without limit, I fear we will one day spend what cannot be repaid, not in money, but in morality. Nixon folded the letter once and set it aside. He didn't know the man's name, Reverend Harper, but the words stayed with him. He poured a small glass of whiskey, leaned back, and stared at the presidential seal on the carpet. How did it come to this? He murmured. The ghosts of the week at Camp David whispered back. Connolly's laughter, Burns's warnings, the pressure of advisors who swore this was salvation. He remembered Connolly saying, "The people don't understand gold, Dick. They understand jobs." And Burns, quiet but insistent, "Mr. President, once you break faith with gold, you'll have to replace it with something greater." Something greater. What could be greater than trust? On the night table beside him sat a framed photograph of his mother, Hannah Nixon, a devout Quaker, who had taught him that honesty was worth more than success. He used to believe that. Now, he wasn't sure. He lifted the photo, studied her eyes, and whispered, "Mother, you always said truth will set you free. But what if truth is bad politics?" He smiled faintly, half irony, half sorrow. Because deep down he knew he had not freed the dollar. He had merely untied it, and in doing so, set something loose that might never be caught again. A few days later, during a press conference, a journalist asked, "Mr. President, how long will this suspension last?" Nixon smiled for the cameras and said, "Only until fairness is restored to world trade." But inside, a small voice answered differently. Forever. That winter, Nixon began to notice how quickly the new system served his ambitions. More dollars meant more spending. More spending meant more jobs, at least on paper. And more jobs meant re-election. But each budget meeting left him with a heavier heart. Every solution seemed to begin with printing, the modern miracle, the painless fix. He once told an aide privately, "It's strange, isn't it? We used to have to dig for gold. Now we just dig into our own faith." By December, foreign leaders demanded new trade terms. Nixon brushed them aside. He had grown accustomed to control, the quiet intoxication of bending reality to will. But that night, sitting again in the Oval Office, he turned off the lights and let the darkness settle. He thought of his decision and how easily it had been made. A weekend at Camp David, a televised address, and 25 centuries of order rewritten. He realized something terrifying, that faith is easier to destroy than to build. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city shimmered beneath Christmas lights. Somewhere in 1,000 homes, children were writing letters to Santa, asking for gifts they believed would come. He envied their innocence. He whispered, "What have I done?" The question wasn't about policy anymore. It was about something older, the moment when a man realizes that even success can taste like sin. History would remember Nixon for Watergate, not for this night. Yet the greater deception had already been signed, sealed, and broadcast to the world. Not the lie of politics, but the illusion of permanence. And as he turned away from the window, he knew that while gold had once restrained nations, now it was conscience that must, or else nothing would. New York City, early 1972. The air on Wall Street was electric, the kind of excitement that hums just before a storm. Traders clapped one another on the back, cigars smoked like incense, and champagne corks popped in brokerage rooms that hadn't known joy since the recession years. The dollar was free, and so were they. "Gentlemen," one broker laughed, raising his glass, We've escaped the golden prison. Laughter followed, loud, confident, careless. The new system of floating currencies was like oxygen to speculators. They could now bet on the dollar's every breath, rise, fall, wobble, and profit from it all. Where nations saw uncertainty, traders saw opportunity. In a corner office overlooking Broad Street sat Robert Klein, a 37-year-old investment analyst who'd risen from a mailroom clerk to a millionaire. He watched the ticker tape spool across his desk, the numbers glowing like scripture. "Gold's down again," his assistant said. "Good," Robert replied. "Gold doesn't pay dividends." He leaned back, lighting a cigarette. "This is the future, Tom. Money without chains. We can make it move wherever we want." Tom hesitated. "Doesn't that scare you? It's all just paper." Robert smirked. "Paper's what built this country. Gold's what slowed it down." Across town, in a modest diner on 9th Avenue, the waitress who served Robert every morning counted her tips. Same coins, same dollars, but they didn't stretch as far anymore. The orange juice had gone up. The eggs, too. Her world shrank while his expanded, both living under the same sun yet walking in opposite directions. At a dinner party that spring, Robert sat among bankers and politicians in tuxedos, the room flickering with chandeliers and ambition. One senator raised his glass and said, "To prosperity unbound. America's ingenuity has triumphed once again." Applause, smiles, toasts. But one man, an older economist named Walter Haynes, who'd served under Roosevelt, remained silent. Robert noticed and asked, "You don't seem convinced, sir." Haynes looked at him, weary but sharp. "Young man," he said, "I've seen what happens when value floats free of virtue. It doesn't float, it sinks." Robert chuckled politely. "With respect, sir, this is progress." "Progress?" Haynes repeated. "Maybe. But tell me this. When everything can be bought, what remains sacred?" The question lingered even as the orchestra resumed playing. Robert brushed it off, but that night, lying awake in his penthouse, he couldn't stop hearing it. He looked out at the Manhattan skyline, towers rising like temples of glass, and felt both awe and unease. The markets were soaring, yet something inside him felt hollow. He'd earned everything he wanted, but the satisfaction faded faster than each transaction. He remembered his father, a small accountant from Queens, who'd once handed him a gold coin as a boy and said, "Son, gold doesn't change. That's why it's honest." He'd sold that coin years ago to buy his first suit. By the end of 1972, Robert's firm reported record profits. He bought a second home in Connecticut, invested in new speculative funds, and hired 2 assistants. Success was no longer the goal, it was the drug, and Wall Street was hooked. Money was no longer a measure of work or worth. It had become a motion, a pulse without morality. For every man like Robert, 10 more followed, convinced they had mastered the invisible. But what none of them saw, not yet, was that the invisible had its own laws. When restraint disappears, so does safety. And the same waves that lifted them now began to gather strength in the deep. Inflation, debt, speculation, the signs were there, faint but growing. Still, the world partied on. When the dollar lost its soul, it gained a shadow, and that shadow now danced through every market, every ledger, every dream that believed profit could exist without price. By 1973, America had adjusted to its new prosperity. But beneath the slogans and smiles, something subtle had changed. Prices moved like restless tides, wages chased shadows, and the certainty that once lived in a dollar bill was now only nostalgia. The news called it the adjustment period. But in living rooms across the country, it felt more like erosion, slow, silent, unstoppable. In Cincinnati, a retired school teacher named Evelyn Ward counted her pension check with trembling hands. It wasn't that she'd grown frail, she'd simply grown careful. Her whole life she'd saved each month, believing that tomorrow would honor today's effort. Now, each trip to the grocery store proved otherwise. "Eggs are 39 cents, she told the clerk, astonished. "They were 28 last month." The clerk shrugged kindly. "They say it's the cost of fuel, ma'am. Evelyn smiled faintly. Funny, truth seems to cost more, too. In Texas, a young mechanic named Hector Ruiz knelt beside a pickup truck, hands black with grease. He'd recently taken out a loan to buy new equipment. When the monthly payment arrived, it was higher than before. Same number on paper, but worth less in reality. At night, he sat on his porch beside his wife, Clara, watching their children chase fireflies. She asked, "Do you think this will get better?" He answered, "It always does." Then, after a pause, "But it never goes back." Clara rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Then maybe we stop chasing and start planting." He smiled. "What do you mean?" "Grow what we can. Fix what we have. Trust what doesn't change." Hector nodded slowly, hearing in her words a kind of wisdom no headline ever carried. In Chicago, a small congregation gathered each Thursday night in the basement of a church, their prayer circle lit by flickering candles. They prayed not for wealth, but for steadiness. They prayed that paper promises would not become their master. Reverend Samuel Harper, the same man who once held $1 up to his congregation, had become a local comforter in this uneasy time. He often told them, money can lose its worth overnight, but kindness, truth, and humility, they never devalue. Some nights, only a few showed up. But he preached anyway, saying softly, "Faith doesn't need a crowd, it needs courage." In New York, the stockbroker Robert Klein walked through Central Park one Sunday, far from the tickers and the noise. He watched a street musician play a slow hymn on his saxophone. Something sorrowful yet clean. Children dropped coins into the open case. Robert reached into his pocket and froze, a dollar bill in his hand, the same kind he'd once worshipped like scripture. He placed it gently among the coins and whispered, "It's only paper." Then, almost as an afterthought, "But maybe it can still do good." For the first time in years, he felt light. Across the country, stories like these unfolded quietly, people rediscovering simplicity, resilience, and each other. When the numbers failed them, they turned to names, neighbors, friends, family. When money lost meaning, meaning returned to what could not be priced. It was as if, through the cracks of inflation and uncertainty, something sacred began to sprout. Humility, because when the world forgets how to measure value, it rediscovers virtue. The great unanchoring had begun, but so too had the quiet rebuilding of faith in things no government could print. The 1980s dawned like a neon sunrise, bright, loud, intoxicating. The world that Nixon's pen had unchained a decade earlier was now sprinting into its new freedom, mistaking motion for progress. Money, once measured by metal, was now measured by confidence, and confidence was everywhere. Banks lent more than they owned. Governments spent more than they earned. Corporations grew faster than their conscience. The global economy floated, but so did morality. In New York, the skyline glittered like a crown. Robert Klein, now older, grayer, and richer, watched the Dow Jones climb to heights no one had imagined. He stood in his corner office, floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting a city worshiping profit. He'd lived to see the birth of credit cards, junk bonds, and leveraged dreams. Money flowed not like a river anymore, but like electricity, invisible, instant, addictive. He whispered to himself, "We did it. We turned faith into finance." But that night, as he rode home in the back of a black limousine, he saw a man sleeping on a subway grate, wrapped in newspaper. The headline above him read, "Stocks hit record high." For a moment, Robert's chest tightened. The contrast struck him, a world of abundance built on absence. He looked away. Across the ocean in London, traders celebrated Big Bang deregulation. The day financial barriers fell and speculation became sport. The city's heart beat to the rhythm of greed, dressed as genius. The brokers called themselves masters of the universe. One of them, Alan Price, toasted with his colleagues in a champagne-flooded bar. He grinned and said, "Gentlemen, we're not bound by gold or God anymore, only by opportunity." They cheered, glasses clinking, as if they had rewritten the laws of heaven and earth. Meanwhile, in a small Midwestern town, Mary Collins, the same housewife who once prayed over her grocery ledger, now watched her grown children wrestle with credit cards and mortgages. She missed the days when saving meant patience, not leverage. Her daughter joked, "Mom, no one uses cash anymore." Mary smiled gently, "Then I suppose no one feels money anymore either." She still kept a jar labeled Faith Fund above the refrigerator, though the bills inside had changed faces and colors over the years. To her, that jar had become something else, a reminder that worth is what you hold on to when the world lets go. By the end of the decade, the numbers on Wall Street had reached the stratosphere, but the debt beneath them had become a mountain no one wanted to measure. Governments borrowed to fund comfort. Corporations borrowed to buy illusions. People borrowed to imitate happiness. And through it all, the printing presses hummed quietly, sanctified by jargon and justified by growth. Economists called it monetary innovation. Prophets might have called it temptation perfected. In 1987, the crash came, sudden, brutal, biblical in tone. The markets that believed themselves gods fell like idols, struck by unseen hands. Robert watched the screens flicker red. His portfolio shrank, but oddly, he felt calm. He whispered, "Maybe this is the reckoning we needed." That night, he went home early, walked past the skyscrapers, and paused in front of a small church lit only by candles. He stepped inside, sat in the last pew, and said nothing. He didn't pray for money. He prayed for mercy. The dollar had survived, but something deeper had not. The moral gravity that once kept societies humble had been replaced by self-belief, a counterfeit divinity. And as the century neared its end, humanity's balance sheet showed growth in every column, except grace. By the dawn of the 1990s, the fever of the free market had cooled into reflection. The crash of 1987 had shaken confidence. But more than that, it had cracked something unseen: the illusion of control. For 2 decades, humanity had chased a golden mirage painted in paper ink. Now, it began to ask, what was all this freedom for? In Kansas City, Reverend Samuel Harper, now gray-haired and slower in step, stood before a modest congregation. The old wooden pews creaked as farmers, teachers, and families bowed their heads. He lifted his worn Bible and spoke softly, "God gave us dominion over the earth, not over truth. When we replaced gold with promise, we thought we were freeing ourselves from limits. But maybe limits were God's way of keeping us human." He paused, scanning the familiar faces. "Maybe," he continued, "this isn't about money at all. Maybe it's about what we believe we can command, and what we should simply trust." The church was silent. No one took notes. No one needed to. In New York, Robert Klein retired from finance and moved upstate, trading skyscrapers for silence. He lived in a cabin near a small lake, where mornings began with birdsong instead of market tickers. Each day he walked the forest trails, thinking of the years he'd spent chasing numbers that never filled him. He'd once believed freedom meant unshackled wealth. Now, he saw it meant something simpler: peace without pretense. On his desk sat a single framed object, an old dollar bill from the 1970s, faded and torn. Across it he had written with a pen, "In God we trust, again." In Tokyo, Kenji Takahashi's daughter, now grown and working as an economist herself, visited her aging father. He sat in the garden, trimming bonsai trees, his movements patient, deliberate. "Father," she asked, "why do you still work on these every morning?" He smiled. "Because it reminds me that growth without pruning leads to chaos." She nodded, realizing he wasn't speaking only of trees. In Paris, the great banks had long since adapted to the floating system. But in a small cafe near the Seine, an elderly journalist, the same one who had written, "The dollar was once the world's promise, now it is its gamble," wrote one final column. His headline read, "Perhaps the true gold is honesty, and we are all poorer when it runs out." Across continents, people who had lived through the Nixon Shock were now grandparents, telling their grandchildren stories that sounded like fables. Once they said money was tied to gold, heavy, real, finite. Then came the day the dollar lost its soul. And though life went on, something invisible had shifted. People stopped trusting what they could not see until they learned slowly to trust again in what they could feel: kindness, work, faith. In Missouri, Reverend Harper's church still stood, smaller but steadfast. The old offering box remained by the altar, its cedar wood darkened with age. Inside lay a few coins and folded bills, and among them, the same dollar he had once held up decades ago. The ink was nearly gone, but the words were still legible. "In God we trust." He smiled as he ran his hand over the box. "For all we've lost," he whispered, "we still have that." That evening, as he locked the church door and stepped into the cool air, the horizon glowed with sunset, gold, eternal, unprinted. He thought of the cycles of nations, rise and fall, wealth and want, and how in every age, humanity's greatest challenge remained the same: to remember that the worth of things is not found in their shine, but in their truth. The Nixon Shock had changed the world's economy, but perhaps its deeper purpose was to remind the world that no matter how high man lifts his own promises, gravity, moral, spiritual, divine, will always bring him back to humility. Half a century had passed since that fateful Sunday night, August 15th, 1971, when President Richard Nixon interrupted television programs across America to announce a decision that changed the world. To many, it had seemed a technicality, a policy move, a financial adjustment, a temporary measure. But time, the great revealer, had shown that it was much more. A turning point where the tangible became abstract and the moral became negotiable. The Nixon Shock had birthed an era where the printing press replaced the pickaxe and confidence replaced restraint. It unleashed creativity, yes, innovation, technology, markets beyond imagination. But it also unshackled temptation to spend without earning, to promise without paying, to believe that faith itself could be monetized. We built skyscrapers higher than cathedrals. We traded more in a day than civilizations once did in a century. We connected the world through invisible lines of credit and code. And yet, somehow, we grew poorer in spirit. The factory worker in Detroit, who once worried about the price of bread, passed away never understanding how a single televised sentence could ripple through every paycheck he'd ever earned. The banker in Tokyo lived to see his nation transformed into an export powerhouse, but at the cost of endless work and sleepless nights, chasing stability that never returned. The pastor in Missouri grew old, preaching that value without virtue is vanity. And the broker in New York died peacefully, his fortune smaller than it once was, but his conscience finally rich. When the world lost its anchor in gold, it was forced, slowly, painfully, to seek a new one. Some anchored themselves in profit, some in progress, but a few rediscovered something rarer: purpose. They found it not in what could be printed, but in what could be promised and kept. In kindness that costs nothing but pays forever, in truth spoken even when expensive, in work done well for its own sake. Economists would later call the post-1971 system fiat money, currency that holds value only because we believe it does. But isn't that true of all human order? Nations, markets, even love, all exist on trust. And when trust fails, no gold can restore it. Perhaps that is what the divine had been teaching us all along. That the true standard of value is not in vaults or reserves, but in the measure of our honesty. So much of life, of history, is a ledger of what we thought we could control. We balance our books, we measure our worth, we count our gains. But heaven's economy uses a different math. Humility over pride, giving over gain, sincerity over spectacle. When gold was our measure, men lied less because the truth weighed something. Now that money is only belief, truth weighs everything. As the century turned and nations continued to rise and stumble, the words on that faded dollar bill, "In God we trust," remained more relevant than ever. Because in the end, all systems fail, all values shift, all currencies fade. But trust, real trust, is the last gold that never tarnishes. And perhaps that was the hidden mercy of 1971, that in losing the weight of metal, humanity might rediscover the weight of meaning. Because when money lost its anchor, The soul was called to become its own. The fire burns lower now. The embers glow like scattered coins, warm, fading, honest. And perhaps that is fitting, because history, too, burns through its illusions until only truth remains. 50 years have passed since the day the dollar lost its soul. Nations have risen, debts have multiplied, crises have come and gone. Yet through it all, one lesson endures. You can suspend gold, but you cannot suspend consequence. When President Nixon ended the gold standard, he believed he was saving the world's economy. In one sense, he did, for a while. Factories kept running, markets recovered, life went on. But what no one foresaw was that an invisible kind of inflation would follow. Not of prices, but of pride. An inflation of desire, of entitlement, of the belief that we could create value without virtue. And like all inflations, it eventually demanded repayment. The decades that followed became a moral mirror. We built more than we needed. We borrowed more than we could return. We trusted paper more than people. And yet, through each collapse, through every recession and revival, something divine kept whispering through the noise. Be still. Remember what truly holds worth. In the quiet spaces, a mother's prayer over a half-empty jar of savings, a pastor's trembling voice in a small-town chapel, a banker's solitary regret at midnight. God was still balancing the books, not in dollars, but in lessons. He was teaching us again and again that every earthly system rests on a moral law as old as creation, that promise without integrity is theft, that gain without gratitude is loss, and that wealth without wisdom is poverty wearing perfume. If the gold standard once held us to the earth, perhaps its removal was heaven's way of calling us upward, away from metal toward meaning. For what is faith, if not the courage to believe in what cannot be seen? Maybe the end of gold was never a fall, but a test. A divine question disguised as an economic policy. When the weight is gone, will you still be honest? And if we listen closely, beyond the noise of markets and politics, beyond the numbers and the news, we might still hear that question echo tonight. Because it is asked not of nations, but of each of us. What is your anchor? What gives your word its weight? Do you spend your life on what endures or what fades? The fire crackles once more, then settles. In its reflection, the faces of all who lived this story, Frank, Kenji, Mary, Reverend Harper, Robert, and countless unseen souls, glow faintly for a moment, then fade into warmth. The world turned that night in 1971, but perhaps heaven smiled softly, not in approval, but in patience. Because even when humanity untethers itself from truth, the Creator knows. Eventually, every soul finds its way back to the measure that cannot be suspended, the measure of honesty. Pause. The fire hisses once. And so, as we close tonight's story, let the lesson linger. When money lost its anchor, it was the heart's turn to hold the line. Moral takeaway and closing reflection. When nations trade truth for convenience, they may prosper for a season. But peace has its own economy, and it never runs a deficit. The real wealth of a people is not their currency, but their conscience. And when the world forgets that, God, in His mercy, sends reminders disguised as crises. Perhaps that's what August 15th, 1971 truly was. A divine audit. Thank you for sitting by the fire tonight. If this story reminded you of what truly gives life its worth, honesty, humility, and faith, then the night has been well spent. If the story touched your heart, share it with the ones you love. And if you'd like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.